Right, good morning. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here on a Friday at 10 a.m. for Beyond Boba. I'm Professor Eric Schlussel, the director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. And I'll just say briefly that the Seeger Center is the DC area's largest and most active center for Asian studies. It's a comprehensive Asian studies center, but we have a very, very special place in our hearts and in our programming for Taiwan studies. And we're extremely happy to host the Taiwan Education Research Program, TERP, run by a very, very capable staff whom I'm profoundly grateful for organizing this event. And I said we're beyond grateful, right? And it's beyond Boba, that's great. So thank you to the TERP, but also the Ministry of Culture for helping sponsoring this activity today. I will now turn the mic over to a proper Taiwan expert, my assistant director, Richard Haddock, who will give proper opening remarks. But I just want to say, really happy to see you, and thanks for being here.
Excuse me. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much again for joining us on a Friday morning. Because we're expecting a large crowd already, a huge crowd for a Friday morning, please just be mindful if folks are going to be squeezing past you for extra seats. Please allow them the courtesy. So I just wanted to, again, welcome everyone online as well as in person joining us. My name is Richard Haddock. I'm the Assistant Director with the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. And I first wanted to just thank our esteemed panelists here to be talking about this very always timely and especially delicious subject. And I also wanted to take this time to thank all of our co-sponsoring organizations, including the Seeger Center, the Taiwan Education and Research Program, the East Asia National Resource Center, which is a Title VI funded Department of Education program here at GW, as well as the East Asia Languages and Literatures Department at GW. And last but not least, also, again, thanking the Ministry of Culture for sponsoring the Spotlight Taiwan program, which this is our very first program of this academic year in a series of programs related to Taiwanese American identities. The Seeger Center and TERP have been longstanding hubs for Taiwan studies across the humanities disciplines. In 2017, our Department of Theater and Dance, as well as National Taiwan University's University of the Arts, co-organized the Cultural Exchange Through Dance program, which culminated in a final exhibition and performance showcasing the results of the exchange among faculty and students. In 2019, TERP and the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures co-hosted Screening and Staging Taiwan, Multiculturalism and Identity Politics, which included film screenings and lectures. We also host regular Taiwan humanities lectures throughout the academic year, including one just last spring on the institutionalization of Hakka music in post-war Taiwan. The project of this year focuses on the formation and transformation of Taiwanese American identities and the creative works produced by Taiwanese American artists to reflect on their journeys of becoming. The project represents our recent efforts to strengthen connections with local Taiwanese American communities and to foster a deeper understanding of evolving Taiwanese American identities. We envision this project as a launching pad for exploring how various generations of Taiwanese Americans reflect on their experiences, forge connections with Taiwan, and imagine the future of Taiwanese American identities through their artistic inspirations and productions. This is the first in a series of 3 events on this series, the next of which is on October 30th, a free screening of the documentary film Love Boat, as well as a virtual symposium on November 1st, which is comprised of 3 events and a keynote address, all on Taiwanese American identity formation. Now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel of speakers. We have first Clarissa Wei joining us online. Clarissa Wei is a journalist and cookbook author. Her debut book, Cookbook, Made in Taiwan, is a celebration of the island nation she calls home. It was the finalist for the 2024 James Beard Award for Best International Cookbook and the International Association of Culinary Professionals Julia Child First Book Award recipient. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Foreign Policy, among other places. She was an award-winning senior reporter at Gold Thread, a video-centric imprint of the South China Morning Post. Her second cookbook, Sitting the Month, is about postpartum recovery and will be published by Norton in 2026. Next, we have Tzu-i Chuang Mullinax, a Taiwanese American chef and food writer currently based in Washington, D.C. Having spent the past 2 decades living across various locations in the U.S., Taiwan, China, and Indonesia, she is driven to explore similarities and differences across culinary cultures and build bridges to understanding between the English and Chinese-speaking food worlds. She is the author of Anthropologist in the Kitchen, or 厨房里的人类学家, in a genre-defining food memoir and several best-selling cookbooks. Her YouTube channel features videos of Western-style cooking presented in Chinese and Chinese-style cooking presented in English. She's the host of the award-winning documentary miniseries, The Melting Wok, Chinese Food's American Dream. Lastly is our esteemed moderator, who will be moderating a discussion with our panelists at the end, is Eileen Chengyin Chow, Associate Professor of the Practice in Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, Director of Graduate Studies in East Asian Studies, and also currently Acting Director of the Asian Pacific Studies Institute at Duke University. Additionally, at Duke, Eileen is the founding and core faculty member in the Asian American Diaspora Studies program, the first of such program in the United States South. And she is the founding director of the Duke Story Lab, a humanities lab dedicated to the study of stories and the communities that coalesce around them. Elsewhere, she is the director of the Xuwo Institute of Chinese Journalism at Zhixin University in Taipei, Taiwan, and serves on the editorial boards of Biographical Literature, the LA Review of Books, Asia Society's China Books Review, and Third State Books. And with Carlos Rojas joining us in the back, Eileen is the co-editor of the Sino-Theory book series for Duke University Press. We're really joined by an outstanding set of speakers here, so please join me in welcoming our guests. And I'll pass it to Eileen for some framing thoughts, and we'll get the conversation started. Thanks again for joining.
Can I sit? Oh, maybe I'll sit, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hi, thank you so much, Eric and Richard. And I love that Richard is wearing a 大同电锅 pin, which is an emblem of my youth. And I'm so honored to be moderating this panel for Clarissa and Tzu-i, both not only authors and writers. Oh, can you hear well? Okay. Is it better now? Okay, good, thank you. So as I said, I'm so honored to be moderating a panel on Beyond Boba, though I'm never Beyond Boba, and I noticed there's a boba place like half a block from here. Do you all go? Is it any good? Eric's like, no. But also that I'm fans of both Clarissa and Tzu-i's writings, and I cook with their books. And so it's really wonderful to be in conversation with them. And I look forward to hearing what they have to say today. My job really is to really kind of just set the tone a little bit. So I thought I'd just say a few things about food studies and why we study food. One of my favorite food writers is MFK Fisher, which a lot of you probably know, the great mid-century French American writer of French cuisine. But, people, always ask her, why do you write about food and not love or war or hunger? And this is in the middle of World War II. And she says, because food is, it's a long passage, but it's one of the most beautiful passages. She says, because food is about the place that we spend together, about the memory we have of this village, that is this hillside that is now bombed away. Food is about hunger. Food is about what we don't have. Food is all those things. So when you ask me, why do I write about food and not love and life and war and hunger, I write about all those things. And I think that is precisely why we are interested in food studies. A really beautiful moment in Tzu-i's documentary series that she made, that she'll be talking about later on, about diaspora, food in diaspora. She and one of her interviewees are sitting on a porch, and they say, So when did you really start thinking about food? And I think, I'm sorry if I'm misquoting, but something along the lines of
We have that clip.
so we'll watch that clip later. But really thinking about food like language is like air. You only recognize it's not there when it's not all around you. And I think that's something that, in my own work, in my own teaching about food, I think a lot about, that food and language are in fact the only two things that all humans share, and in one form or another. And so when we think about food, there's so many different ways, and there's such a history of thinking about food studies, right? Food is a bodily process. Food is about inside and outside boundaries of the body. What is native, what is foreign, the theorizing of the body by what we ingest and what we expel. And really, in a real genuine way, food is the cut, right? Food is what comes in and out, and we are also food. And our body, the skin, is really the kind of permeable boundary between what is inside and outside, and food. So therefore, are both things, items, objects, but they're also the set of relations that constitute us. Which is why environmental studies, another very important popular topic these days, always starts as food, because food studies is the most urgent and direct and intimate core of environmental studies. Food, of course, is often thought about as cuisine, right? Food is, so therefore, who claims what cuisine, what are rituals, what are etiquette, from religious to cultural. Food is history, food is cultural memory, food is identity, something that both Clarissa and Tzu-i explore extensively in their work. But food is also sometimes issues about authenticity and cultural appropriation. I don't know if you all are as chronically online as I am, but you know that in the past week that Simulio has been in a whole controversy about Boba, in fact, about Beyond Boba, because when someone pitching a boba tea product to him, he brought up the issue of cultural appropriation, for which he raised valid concerns, but for which he's also gotten an incredible amount of flack, right? So showing that this is never a kind of set in stone narrative, that we're always constantly questioning what is food, who owns cuisine, and how is food transformed. And maybe that's what's interesting about food studies, that it's always about a set of relations. It never is a kind of frozen in stone aspect. Food is also about danger, frankly. Food is always about, food safety is a huge topic here, but also globally, and especially also in Sinosphere spaces. The history of Chinese food history is also replete with examples of cannibalism and discussions of scarcity and starvation. And so when we study food, it can never be just about cuisine, right? It's always about all these things and other things. And so thinking about both the material and discursive aspects of food, and food is also about storytelling. And we have two great storytellers with us today, precisely because that food, what is food if not narrativized? That we always have to think a little bit about how we eat, what we eat, or the origins of what we eat, and the memories surround them. So in terms of Taiwan food, another kind of big, you could say, big and complicated topic that Clarissa very directly takes on in her book, and so I'll leave it to her to talk about. And Tzu-i also has I think in a more indirect way, as someone from Taiwan who cooks globally, right, who cooks a whole range of cuisines, but as she calls herself, anthropologist in the kitchen. So to think about, like, what does it mean to be someone who has this, you could say, heritage of growing up on Taiwan food, and then also embracing a kind of hybrid nature of cuisine. And so to think about those issues, we always come back to the notion of narrative. And so what does food tell us about culture? And food is always transforming. I love how my friend, the historian Miranda Brown, has said, she said, think about one of the most popular dishes at Panda Express, which is sesame chicken, orange chicken. And she says it's the ultimate American food because it is breaded, it is sweet, and it is chicken. And so, but to think about like the ways that we always think about food adaptation. But Taiwan food then adds a whole nother issue of discussion of Taiwanese-ness, right? What is Taiwan? What is Taiwan food? A really wonderful, groundbreaking book by Chen Yuzhen about Taiwan, she puts in quotes, Taiwan Cai, is really tracing the kind of cultural material history of Taiwan food. And in fact, talking about both its connection and disconnection from what we might think generally as mainland, I mean that, in the continental sense, mainland Chinese food, when Chinese food itself is also kind of a fictive concept, right? That, it is also many regional cuisines that have adapted over time. But the kind of self-consciousness of what is Taiwan food, both in the 19th century, which she also traces to the late 19th and early 20th century of Taiwan ryori, kind of really much kind of a naming of Taiwan liaoli, right? Taiwan ryori by Japanese colonial sort of cultural elites, but also the way to the very contemporary moment, which I'll leave to Clarissa and Tzu-i, talking about innovating, thinking about what constitutes Tai Cai or Taiwan Cai or Taiwan cuisine in this new moment, both on a kind of foodways and kind of folkways development of the cuisine, of collecting, something that Clarissa and her collaborators have done really beautifully in her book, of putting together and the kind of wisdom from many, many different parts of the island, of the country, to say what might constitute this collective that we think of as Taiwan cuisine, but also something that we will talk about, which is a very new generation of chefs that very self-consciously make a kind of elevated cuisine known as Taiwan cuisine, right? That I had the good fortune of going to a few places just last month, and the sort of deliberateness by which it's presented as Taiwan food is really interesting too, right? And so that's something that we'll have a chance to talk about in both ways. Finally, I should just end with saying that this talk is called Beyond Boba, which is catchy. As I mentioned, I'm never beyond boba. Had 2 bobas probably this past week. But also that the history of boba, which I think Clarissa has written a long time ago. I think I remember reading an article about that. But that I've talked about with my students, and frankly, probably was my most attended talk, but probably because we were giving out free boba. And like 100 people, like people clawing in the window, hoping to get what is the attraction there? But to think about how boba itself is a hybrid product, right? Both a kind of inheritance of British milk tea from Hong Kong, tapioca type desserts from Southeast Asia, the growth of a dairy industry in Taiwan that was to counter post-colonial effects, but also, the sort of cultural imperial nature of Nestle as a global, as a conglomerate. I grew up lactose intolerant, still am lactose intolerant, and very much that drinking dairy was a novelty, but in my childhood in the 80s, suddenly we had all sorts of papaya milk and very many developments of dairy products, dairy desserts, as a way of kind of also encouraging Taiwan's nascent dairy industry and encouraging people to consume dairy on a daily process. Boba, its origins a little bit disputed. Two stores claimed the first, but comes out of this, innovation, right? This innovation, this hybridity, and creating this thing that we call bubble tea or pearl tea. It also is very much part of the diaspora, something that Clarissa and Tzu-i both talk about in their work, that, in its transplantation to the LA, Monterey Park, Chinatown, etc., Chinese communities, it goes through a different transformation. In fact, even calling it boba, which in Chinese is frankly a very impolite term, meaning big boobs, floating on milk, and so it also says something about linguistics, right? So for example, I just said boba probably like 20 times in the last 10 minutes, but I have never said boba really to order the drink in Chinese, right? Because in Chinese, it seems not the right name for it, and I would never call it that, plus it's kind of rude. But in English, it has taken on its own new nomenclature as boba tea, and that is also a product of the diaspora and its transplantation and transformation in diaspora. So even something as straightforward as boba, we might think of as having this incredibly complicated history, environmentally, materially, culturally, product of imperialism, product of globalization and transnationalism. So just think how much more complicated when we embrace something talking about a national cuisine like Taiwan food, right? So, but I think our two speakers will do a great job enlightening us and educating us and giving us food for thought. Thank you.
So just a quick note before Clarissa will start with your presentation. I do also want to note we do have books for sale. The Made in Taiwan cookbook is just right outside our doors, so we can help you collect a copy afterwards, as well as QR codes for Tzu-i's many works as well. So stay tuned for that. And so I'd like to pass the microphone now to Clarissa for a presentation. Thank you.
Great. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah? You guys can hear me right before I go on. Okay, perfect. Thank you guys so much for holding this event and having me here. It's such an honor to be talking to people who, you know, I'm assuming many of you guys are already very knowledgeable about Taiwanese history and the politics of Taiwan. And in my presentation today, I really just sort of want to give a brief overview about how I used food to tell the story of Taiwan, but also how the history of Taiwan really helped me tell the story of Taiwanese food. So I have a little bit of a PowerPoint slide, so bear with me as I toggle around my screens and figure this out just a second. Okay, present. And all the photos in this PowerPoint slide is from my team. I worked with a all Taiwanese team, a Taiwanese recipe developer, a Taiwanese researcher, a photographer, and food stylist. So it was a lot of fun. In fact, I felt like the outsider because I was born and raised in LA. So let me go ahead and share. Sorry, I'm not great at this. Okay, perfect. Okay, so Made in Taiwan was actually born out of frustration. It felt like, you know, people were not really understanding what Taiwan was, and Taiwan and Taiwanese food, at least to me as a perspective of a food writer, Taiwanese food was reduced to one-dimensional stereotypes. And I really think that reflects on the title of today's event, Beyond Boba. I started out in my career writing about Taiwanese Chinese restaurants in the United States, in New York, and then LA. And when this was in the 2012, 2013. And whenever someone talked about Taiwanese food, it was beef noodle soup, guapao, boba. And when I was growing up, my parents are from Tainan in the South. So I was used to all of these dishes that aren't necessarily represented as much in America. And when I started to realize this conversation around Taiwanese food in the West, I was really confused because I sort of felt this disconnect between what I was exposed to during my trips to Taiwan versus what people were talking about in the States. And I just thought, you know, maybe my family's a little bit weird. Maybe I don't know anything about Taiwanese food until I started digging into the history. So when I first pitched this book, actually in 2020, all the major publishers rejected it. People said, we don't care about Taiwanese food. Oh, we already have a book from another Taiwanese blogger, like a blogger of Taiwanese heritage. Her book wasn't even about Taiwanese food. Someone just said I wasn't as enthused about the food. In 2021, the first publisher that we pitched it to again, Simon & Schuster, picked it up immediately. And so what had changed between 2020 to 2021? A couple of things. Stop Asian Hate happened. People really processed, you know, COVID. And the biggest thing was that China was sending lots of warplanes to Taiwan. So Taiwan was constantly in the news. So the geopolitics was front and foremost. So it really took, news and current events for people to show interest in this book, which is kind of sad, but that's kind of the reality of the market. So my whole mission was to define what Taiwanese food is. And again, I feel like the perception is stuck in certain dishes. And I've met a lot of people when they know I'm from Taiwan, they'll say, oh, Taiwan has such great regional Chinese food. And I don't necessarily think that's true today. So I felt like there was a disconnect between what people thought we are eating here in Taiwan versus what we are actually eating in Taiwan. So these are some of the pictures in my book, and these are what I was throwing around as cover options. I really wanted to celebrate, like the pink one actually was my first choice because I think this actually reflects what Taiwanese people eat on a day-to-day basis, right? But an average American or Westerner, when they see this, you probably don't actually know what these dishes are because we don't have restaurants dedicated to tau mi fan, stirred fried rice noodles, or fern, or milkfish belly. You see more on what's on this side. Sorry, directions are weird. On this side, the sanbeiji, the 3 cups chicken, the stinky tofu, the fried rice. And so eventually I ended up going with this, but my heart was sort of set on telling the story of what people actually eat on a day-to-day basis. And so when I was trying to develop this book, I really started with the building blocks of Taiwanese cuisine. And this was my eureka moment, because as a Taiwanese American, when you Google Taiwanese recipes, everything is kind of just mixed together. And when I say that is when you look up a recipe for lulo fan, braised pork belly over rice, you'll see, oh, Shaoxing wine, light soy sauce, dark soy sauce. But actually, when I went to the Gama Diam, the corner store in Taiwan, I couldn't find any of those condiments. Yeah, you can find it in Taiwan, but you kind of have to look a little bit harder. And when I was just researching, I started to realize, hey, the building blocks of Taiwanese cuisine is very specific to Taiwan. And the reason why, my mom was using oyster sauce or light soy sauce and like dark soy sauce in the 80s and 90s was just because it wasn't as easy for her to get access to Taiwanese ingredients. And when I came to Taiwan, then I started to sort of figure out, okay, this is what Taiwanese people use. Oh, my mom used this. And I do remember when she used, at some certain point, she just used Jingnan soy sauce. And she didn't use any other soy sauce. And I just thought, maybe she is, not open to things. But when I moved to Taiwan, I realized, this is the de facto soy sauce. And I started to dig deeper into these styles. So Taiwanese soy sauce is actually more similar to how Japanese soy sauce is made. Our black vinegar is not like Chinese black vinegar at all. It's actually more similar to Japanese Worcester sauce. And that's because the Japanese monopolize and formalize all of our industries. So our core condiments are actually more stylistically similar to Japanese condiments than Chinese condiments. But my whole entire life, I was told, Taiwan is a subset of, or rather, when you're a Taiwanese American in the States in the 90s, people don't really make as much of a distinguishment, at least not in my family. So I was just kind of under the assumption that Taiwanese food was more similar to Chinese food than anything. So sort of figuring out these building blocks really helped me shape my story. And from there, I dove into the history. And what I did was I divided my book into different historical periods and chose dishes from there. So the first one is the 16th century to the 17th century. And this is kind of the food that I grew up with in Tainan. And this was when the first Chinese immigrants came over via Fujian, and there was also a Dutch influence. The Dutch were the first to establish aquaculture farms in Taiwan. So a lot of sweet potato, and you see sweet potato actually in both of these dishes, even though it's not apparent. So the oaden, the oyster omelet, it's sort of that gloopy texture. It's thickened with sweet potato starch. This soup is a mackerel soup. And again, they'll add a slurry of sweet potato starch to thicken it up. And that's because sweet potato grows really well in our subtropical climate. And because rice, is much more labor intensive, potatoes and starch-like tubers were used to sort of bulk things up to make things more hearty. And then came the Japanese, and this is what I like. This again, still blows my mind to this day. They formalized and monopolized a lot of our industries. So I'll give soy sauce as an example. I'm sure a lot of you guys know, especially if you are foodies, that Taiwan, we have black bean soy sauce. But black bean soy sauce was a style brought over in the 16th century by Fujianese immigrants. And now today, this industry still exists, but it's still mostly in the south west of Taiwan. When the Japanese came, they started their giant soy sauce factories, and they started to make soy sauce with yellow soybeans. Sorry, I should go back. Black bean soy sauce is soybeans made with soy sauce made with black soybeans. Taiwan, I believe, is the only country in the world that still has this style. They might make it a little bit in small quantities in China or in Japan, but Taiwan really took this industry, like the Fujianese immigrants took this industry to Taiwan and really made it a big industry. But when the Japanese came, that industry shrunk and became small. And they started, the Japanese started Japanese style soy sauce factories where they made soy sauce out of yellow soybeans and used toasted wheat and koji. And to this day, especially in northern Taiwan, our biggest soy sauce brand is Jinlan. And I remember calling Jinlan up because I was just trying to figure out how to describe to the average reader what the difference is between Chinese soy sauce, Taiwanese soy sauce, and Japanese soy sauce. So I had listed all of these ingredients and techniques. And I remember during that conversation, I was like, okay, wait, so what you're telling me is that Taiwanese soy sauce is more stylistically similar to how they make, all-purpose shoyu or soy sauce in Japan. And the person on the end of the phone was like, I guess so. I never thought about it that way. And that was kind of that moment, because people here in Taiwan, they're not thinking philosophically about if their condiments or if their ingredients are more similar to China or more similar to Japan. They're just kind of doing a recipe that has been passed down by many generations. And like I mentioned before, this same sort of conversation happened with with black vinegar, heizu. So I was commissioned a story by Bon Appetit to explain what black vinegar is. And I was looking into Chinese black vinegars, and basically with that, it's, rice that has been fermented, and because of the Maillard reaction, it becomes black. And I was just sort of confused about how we make it in Taiwan, because that doesn't seem to be in the case at all. So in Taiwan, actually what they do is they ferment the rice. They basically make a rice vinegar, kind of like the clear rice vinegar that you see, and then they infuse it with vegetables and fruit. So it's not a true black vinegar in the Chinese sense where it's aged. It's a rice vinegar, like a clear one, that has just been infused with a lot of flavors. And I remember Googling it, and I found this obscure radio interview that a journalist in Taiwan did with a founder or a second generation owner of a vinegar factory in Taiwan. And he was like, yeah, this style is similar to Japanese Worcester sauce. And the Japanese had copied this technique from the UK, which again was such a mind-blowing moment for me. And so when I was sort of developing my thesis about, what really is Taiwanese food, I realized that the Japanese had much more impact than I could perceive. I think a lot of people think, Taiwanese food is mostly influenced by China, because from a very shallow level, there are a lot of similarities, right? But from a building block, more of a molecular level, if you will, the Japanese have had an incredible influence. Next, this is something I also really love that I don't think most people think about, is the American influence. So as I'm sure many of you guys know, during the Cold War, America flooded Taiwan with $1 billion of economic aid. And interestingly enough, one of those economic aid initiatives was to give Taiwan, to offload shipments of wheat to Taiwan. This was part of the Food for Peace Act, I believe. The problem is people in Taiwan didn't really know how to work with wheat because we are a rice producing country. And so bakers in Taiwan were actually sent to Kansas to learn how to bake, to learn how to make American style rolls. And during this time, as you guys very well know, 1940s, 1950s, this was when the Kuomintang government had come to Taiwan. And so naturally, there were people from northern China who had this history with wheat, and they were taking the wheat and crafting these, noodles, buns, dumplings, the 早餐店, what I think a lot of the diaspora associate with Taiwanese breakfast, and that's youtiao, dough crullers, soy milk, sesame flatbread. That was sort of born from that Chinese side. I'll get more into the Kuomintang influence later, but the American shipment of wheat to Taiwan changed our food culture once again. We started to have bakeries pop up, and bakeries, that technique of making, anpan red bean buns, that was from the Japanese, but those were very much baked on very small scale and only sold at the Taichia, the wet markets. But once we got an influx of wheat, then you started to see, bakeries in every front. And because of this economic aid, and as many of you guys know, especially if you're Taiwanese American or Taiwanese, you know that there is this love of American culture in Taiwan, this romanticism around American culture. And that's where a lot of our night market staples like yansuji, the daji pai, the deep fried chicken, that was sort of born out of this. Oh, look, America, they have fried chicken. Let's do fried chicken in Taiwan, but we'll add our own spices. The night market steak, which I love, that, and for people who aren't familiar with Taiwan, apologize. So the night market steak is, you can go to a night market and sit at a steakhouse outside, and you get a crappy piece of meat with black pepper sauce and spaghetti. That was also born out of a love of American cuisine. And one dish, which is the one over here, the hamburger, I think my head is covering it. This is what I think is the most overlooked Taiwanese food that is a part of our daily life here in Taiwan, but people just ignore it for some reason, is the fact that we eat hamburgers for breakfast. And this was started by, and the chain that started this all is called Mayor May. And it was started by a guy who watched TV and saw, hot dog stands and was like, oh, this is cool. Maybe I do this in Taiwan, but sell hamburgers instead and for breakfast. And it worked. And to this day, when you go outside to any neighborhood in Taiwan, you can find these breakfast restaurants. But these hamburger breakfast restaurants, what they serve is hamburgers. They'll have danbing, they'll have the sandwich that you see here as well. But for some reason, that hasn't translated over to the diaspora, or that hasn't translated over to Taiwanese America, even though I would argue this is more popular in Taiwan than your fan tuan, your youtiao, your dough cruller. And a lot of that, again, has to do with immigration patterns as well. A lot of the people, like my family, who immigrated over to the States moved in the 80s or 90s. And that was around the time when, hamburger for breakfast was starting to become popular. So obviously, my parents didn't really grow up with this. And so because they didn't grow up with it, that wasn't passed down to the second generation, to myself. So I love how there's a subtle American influence to a lot of classic Taiwanese dishes. And then another one, which is covered a lot, is the Kuomintang influence. A story I really like to tell is how I sort of figured out the origins of beef noodle soup. if you Google online, people will tell you that beef noodle soup was started in Kaohsiung at a military village, and it was people from Sichuan that were working with doubanjiang, and that's how they came up with this dish, because the base, the hongsao flavor, the red braised flavor, comes from doubanjiang, which is a red fermented chili paste. But I interviewed so many people for this and realized that's not actually the complete story. I actually found a guy who worked as a lawyer, and when he was in school, he ate at over 100 beef noodle soup restaurants, I would say more than 100, maybe a couple hundred beef noodle soup restaurants all over Taiwan in the 90s. He documented every single one. And he introduced me to a bunch of chefs, and we just got talking. And one of the chefs told me, beef noodle soup is actually a combination of the influences from the people who came from all over China. So, for example, people from Guangdong, they're really good at making broths. People who ate halal didn't eat, pork. They had a history of eating beef because I don't know if most of you guys know, eating beef was taboo in Taiwan until just 30 years ago. The noodles came from people from the north who were really good at pulling hand-pulled noodles. And I remember going to Ximending to like one of the oldest beef noodle soup restaurants in Taiwan, and they said when they first started out, it was just noodles and broth. They didn't have beef. They didn't have the doubanjiang. The doubanjiang obviously did come from Sichuanese immigrants. But then over the years, these noodle vendors would copy other noodle vendors in Taiwan. If you've been to Taiwan, you know how people love to copy one another. And slowly it built up to what we know today as beef noodle soup. And actually, interestingly enough, this beef noodle soup that you see now, the hongsao, isn't that popular in Taiwan anymore as much as it was back then, because hongsao is all about like heavy spices to cover up the quality of the meat. Because when they first made it, beef was really cheap, and when they ate it, it was like cows that were dying or sick, and no one wanted to eat it. But now most of the beef in Taiwan is imported from Australia or the US. And so it's really high quality meat, so you don't want to cover it up. So I think beef noodle soup is such a great metaphor for the history of Taiwan. I don't have that much time, so I will keep going, but feel free to ask me to elaborate on any of this. And then the last one is where we come today, which is a new Taiwanese identity. I have been living in Asia full time, Hong Kong and then Taiwan for over 6 years now. And I remember when I first came, actually, Eileen, when I met you, we were at a Tzu-i Dian. Right. And when my friends were telling me Tzu-i, I was like, I don't actually know what that is. And then when I went, I was like, oh, this is a Haitan Dian, which is a seafood restaurant. The term Tzu-i, and sorry, I should describe for people who don't know what this is. Tzu-i refers to a type of restaurant that is outdoor, usually outdoors, evening only, and it's large greasy plates of food that have been fried on a wok, and you're just drinking beers and shots to go with it. Think short stools, plastic chairs, and it's where people congregate at the end of the week. But as a terminology, Tzu-i really came into being in the 80s and 90s, and it's kind of a combination of like all of the different influences that I had just talked about. So sometimes you'll see sashimi platters, sometimes you'll see mapo tofu, sometimes you'll see, stinky tofu or like milkfish belly, which is something that has been around from the 16th century. So when people ask me, when I go to Taiwan and I want to eat a very Taiwanese have a very Taiwanese dining experience, I always recommend that they go to the Tzu-i store. But again, it's interesting how, because my parents moved away in the 80s, they didn't necessarily know this term. And now you also see people really embracing our Indigenous past as well. A lot of the fine dining restaurants are really figuring out what ingredients are endemic to Taiwan and how do we leverage that. And I've seen the sense of new Taiwanese identity become stronger and stronger the more Taiwan feels at threat. from China, and the more we are asked to define our identity. The story I can give you is I covered the inauguration banquet this past January, I believe. It's all blurred. I don't remember when it was. I didn't actually go to the inauguration banquet, but I went to the tasting where they were doing the final dress rehearsal before they, served the esteemed dignitaries and the president and all of his people. And for the first time ever, he actually hired two food writers to put it together. They actually hired two food writers to put together the menu. And their concept actually was to have a dish from all of the periods that I actually just described. And the only thing that I didn't talk about that they wanted to put in there that was actually sadly sort of scrapped a little bit was the Southeast Asian immigrants, because in recent years we've had a lot of immigrants from Southeast Asia, and they have also impacted our cuisine as well. A great example I can give is if you go to the Thai restaurants in Taiwan, you get this shrimp mooncake that's like flat and made with shrimp paste and fried. And I'm not exactly sure if this is true, but colloquially everyone says you don't find that dish in Thailand. That's a Taiwanese dish. That's a dish that was invented in Taiwan, but everyone thinks it's Thai. So these food writers had worked with two different chefs. One chef represents old Taiwanese dining. One chef is this young, fine dining rock star. And together, the four of them designed this menu to represent all of these facets of Taiwanese identity today. And, when I was talking to these food writers, it was very much clear, and I feel the same as well, that we are still very much trying to figure out what Taiwanese identity is in Taiwan. But right now, the best that we can do is sort of learn from our past, and what people are embracing is that we have so much diversity, and that diversity comes from all of the waves of immigration and the influences that all the different waves of governance have brought us today. So that's my time, and I'm happy to share more with you later on during the Q&A.
Thank you, Clarissa, and thank you folks also listening online too. And that's right, I totally forgot about Rechao. And next we have Tzu-i Chuang Mullinax.
Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Clarissa, and hi everyone. I'm really honored to be here to share with you my thoughts on this fascinating topic. I think this is really an exciting time, especially exciting time to be talking about Taiwanese food. In large part due to the publication of Clarissa's book, which has greatly raised the visibility of Taiwanese food in the English-speaking part of the world. And also because Taiwanese restaurants are just popping up everywhere, and people are starting to recognize how delicious our food is. I was just with my family last weekend in this brew pub craft beer place in Fairfax last weekend. And from the outside, you wouldn't even know that it's a Taiwanese restaurant. It's a brew pub and very modern. And inside, everything they serve, all the food was Taiwan xiaochi, like street food, snack food. And we look around in the packed restaurant. My kids and I were the only Asian faces there. And yet everybody was eating popcorn chicken and gua bao and real fan. I feel quite moved and very proud. But to me personally, I think the most exciting part about Taiwanese food is that it is an identity in the making. It is an ongoing social, cultural, political project. And everyone who eats and cares about Taiwan plays a part in shaping it. And cookbooks in particular have always been a medium for shaping and promoting national identity. So when I was a student of anthropology, way back when, I read this seminal essay by anthropologist Arjan Appadurai called How to Make a National Cuisine. It was published in the late 1980s, in which he talked about how during that era, there was an explosion of cookbooks written in English about Indian food. And you have all these authors picking out representative dishes from different regions in India and put them in overarching cross-cutting categories. Like there's bread, lentil, poultry, and curry, like all these categories to shape a national identity where previously this overarching framework of Indian food did not exist. So that's one example. And then Michelle King in her more recent book about Fu Pei Mei, a lot of people are nodding their heads. So she's widely known as the Julia Child of Taiwan. She taught cooking on television for 40 years. And so Michelle King talked about how Fu Pei Mei's 3 classic volumes on Chinese regional cooking were like the embodiment or enabler of the nationalist government's claim that Taiwan was the standard bearer of Chinese culture during the post-war era instead of China. So Clarissa's book, in a similar way, but on the opposite end of the ideological spectrum, is a political manifesto through recipes. It's an eloquent participant in the forum about what is and should constitute Taiwanese food. So what is Taiwanese food? We just heard this overview from Clarissa. So his cultural historian Chen Yuzhen pointed out that the meaning of Taiwanese food changes according to the context and varies through the ages. Suffice it to say that from a marginalized regional cuisine made to seem inferior during the nationalist authoritarian era to the increasingly popular and trendy but still narrowly defined culinary style rooted in the Southern Hokkien tradition of the island's ethnic majority, to now a much broader concept embracing the multiculturalism of present-day Taiwan. It has come a long way. Clarissa just mentioned the presidential inauguration banquet of this year in May, but there was another watershed moment in the history of Taiwanese food, and that was year 2000 when Chen Shui-bian was inaugurated into presidency. And in that banquet, for the first time, instead of serving the traditional high-end dishes like shark fins and giant abalones, which they decided to dispense with on the ground that these things are environmentally not sustainable. Instead, they incorporated elements of Tainan xiaochi, southern street food, like shimu yuantang, milkfish soup, and steamed rice cake. And that menu completely disrupted the entrenched culinary hierarchy, the old ideas of high and low, and introduced an ecological consciousness. And it really ushered in a new era of thinking about what Taiwanese food should be. And it really became a conscious part of our nation building. So this time around, Taiwanese food is no longer a regional variant of Chinese food, or even one that only corresponds to the food culture of the Hokkien ethnic majority. It now has to describe the reality of a multicultural nation, vis-a-vis, on the one hand, our colonial and authoritarian past, and on the other, the giant presence that is China. So one way to counter the old-style China-centric narrative is to acknowledge the multicultural nature of Taiwan's population and to give representational space and respect to groups and cultures that were formerly overlooked. Right now, we officially recognize 5 ethnic groups. So there's the Hokkien, which comprises about more than 70%, and Hakka, about 10%, and then 10% mainlanders. Bear in mind that there's a lot of intermarriage, so it's really not very clear cut. And then about 2% of Aboriginal, under which there are 16 recognized tribal groups. And then a 5th group, of Xinzhumin, the new residents, new Taiwanese, which refer to foreigners who have become Taiwanese citizens, mostly Southeast Asians like Vietnamese and Indonesians who have married Taiwanese and have had a 2nd generation. Now we have grown-ups who were raised in these intermarriages. And in this most recent presidential inauguration in May, in the banquet, these 2 food writers who were both good friends of mine and their chef friends, they designed a menu that made a very strong point of paying homage to all 5 ethnic groups. So, for example, there was one dish, the opening appetizer was a dish of seasonal local vegetables with 5 dipping sauces, and each sauce was representative of one particular ethnic group. And then they actually went so far as asking and telling people that encouraging people to mix it up. Is that it tastes even better when you mix up all these sauces. And so that's one example of like very conscious identity making of Taiwanese food, and also Aboriginal cooking, which used to be very much overlooked. Now is very visible. You see young chefs being very inspired by Aboriginal techniques of cooking over wood fire or over heated river rocks, and embody Aboriginal knowledge of wild herbs and vegetables, which are indigenous to our land. And I should add that some of our most respected and influential chefs are themselves of Aboriginal origin. And there are many of them, but I'm thinking in particular, the most well-known of them is Alex Peng, whose restaurant Atama, from the Rukai language, is this tiny, beautiful place located in the tribal land in Pingdong in the mountain. It's very hard to get to, and yet it's the hardest to book restaurant in the whole country. And it's amazingly sophisticated and beautiful. Everything cooked over wood fire and forage or hunted. It's an amazing place. So a growing contingent of young chefs in Taiwan now think of Taiwan Wei, the taste of Taiwan, the flavor of Taiwan. And they use the word Taiwan Wei instead of Taiwan Cai, because Taiwan Cai feels contested. It's still ambiguous. So they're trying to create a distinctive Taiwan Wei. And they think of Taiwan Wei as food that arises out of our terroir. So this terroir, the French concept, based on the root word terre, for land, that extends to the climate and the soil and the accumulation of the knowledge and wisdom of the people who inhabit and cultivate the land. It is a belief that when you eat something made in a particular place, you are tasting the terroir, the land and the culture. This concept works very well in the agriculturally rich Taiwan. And so for example, Chef Kai Ho He Shun Kai of a Michelin 3-star restaurant named his restaurant Taihua for a celebration of Taiwan's terroir. The idea is to use globally recognizable format and culinary language to showcase the bounty and flavor combinations that are unique to Taiwan. And this is really done on all levels, from very sophisticated fine dining to casual pubs and cafes. And can we call the result Taiwan Cai? It's Taiwanese, like a Taiwanese cuisine. It's still debatable because it's still in flux. But there is certainly a contemporary and creative take on Taiwan Wei. So we see growing enthusiasm for a more locally rooted, ecologically sound, and culturally open approach to food, which is wonderful. At the same time, there's also always a push to further differentiate Taiwan from China culinarily. It makes a lot of sense that the people of Taiwan will want to distance ourselves from a superpower that threatens to invade us all the time. But when it comes to food, I've often felt that the distancing is a little problematic and comes at a cost. And here I want to share with you my personal food memory growing up in the 70s and 80s in Taiwan. I am what you would call a 第三代外省人, a third-generation mainlander. Both sets of my grandparents came from China in 1949. My paternal grandparents are from Jiangsu Qingpu, which now belongs to Shanghai metropolitan area. And my maternal grandparents were from Sichuan in the southwest. So with one set of the family, we habitually ate lion's head meatball, bamboo shoots and ham, rice cooked with slivers of bok choy. With the other set of the family, we ate mapo tofu, dry fried green beans, double cooked pork, etc. And on top of that, until the age of 6, I lived in the house of my nanny so that my mom could go to college and then graduate school. My nanny, who is now 92 years old, is of the Hokkien local ethnic background. And she cooked things like stewed pork with soy sauce, sugar, and lots of fried shallots. And also we ate a lot of like reconstituted dry salted baby squids, which we then shredded to flavor rice porridge. And then her husband, again, is from a different area. Her husband was a KMT, a veteran soldier from Shandong, a northern province, where the diet was heavily based on wheat. And so we regularly made dumplings from scratch. And every meal was accompanied by mantou, a very sturdy kind of steamed bread, and sometimes even 档子头. this baked bread that you can only break with a hammer. And they drank sorghum wine every night. So looking back, I find myself incredibly lucky to have been raised on such a varied diet from a young age, encompassing the regional culinary traditions of North, South, East, and West. It made me feel comfortable with a wide range of ingredients and flavor combinations, and thus made me feel maybe more open-minded toward future encounters with still more new ingredients and flavor combinations. The childhood taste memory became a part of my native food vocabulary and grammar, which is an amazingly rich resource that informs all of my later culinary explorations and experimentations. In many ways, the food landscape of Taiwan is just like my personal experience writ large. On the streets in Taiwan, wagyu or oami sauce, like steamed rice cake and oyster rice noodles, can be right next to baozimantou, steamed bread, and bao, or hand-shaved noodles, all these northern stuff. Doujiang shaobing youtiao, the fried cruller, and sesame flatbread are as naturally a choice for breakfast as rice noodle soup or the meermei, the Taiwan-style, Taiwan interpretation of American burgers. I was so happy to see that included in Clarissa's book. Until I lived in Hong Kong in my 30s, I had no idea just how unique the Taiwanese food scene was. True, Hong Kong is a global city where you can find all kinds of international delicacies. But when it came to Chinese food, at least back in the early 2000s, it was firmly a southern city rooted in its Cantonese and to some extent Chaoshan tradition. You could not find bready things or chewy noodles. If you wanted to find spicy foods, good luck. I remember back then there was probably 2 Sichuan restaurants in Hong Kong Island and 1 in Kowloon. And other than that, you couldn't find anything spicy. And then when I moved to Chengdu in Sichuan in 2017, I noticed the same kind of regionalism. Everywhere I went, it's Chuancai, complete with a huge variety of wonderful dishes, from robust country fare to sophisticated Sichuan fine dining. But if you want to find other styles of Chinese food, again, good luck. There are some Guizhou, Yunnan, Shanxi style cooking to be found, which are basically the culinary relatives of Sichuan from the northwest and southwest region. But if you want to find anything beyond that, it's very hard. Taiwan is different and unique. A culinary cosmopolitanism is built in. We have elements of all the internal different ethnic groups. And then we have the Japanese connection, the American connection, and the China connection resulting from our complex history. You can hate the authoritarian nationalist government and criticize its subjugation of the local population and culture all you want, righteously. But I think trying to weed out the Chinese culinary elements is like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The incorporation of so many regional elements is a product of our complex history. It's part of our culinary DNA. It's an asset to be embraced, not baggage to be shed. These days, I see a lot of young Taiwanese people shying away from eating and cooking Chinese food because it somehow seems illegitimate and politically incorrect. Know that in English, the word Chinese is somewhat neutral. It can be cultural, linguistic, ethnic, and political. But in the Chinese language, 中国 is very loaded. Most Taiwanese people don't identify as 中国人. And it feels increasingly weird to eat 中国菜 or even 中菜, the abbreviation. Unless a dish initially introduced by mainlanders has been thoroughly localized, like beef noodle soup or scallion pancakes, the tendency often is to not dwell on it. I've seen restaurants in Taipei going so far as to call themselves 四川料理, 江浙料理, using the Japanese word 料理 for cuisines to mark the foreignness of these regional Chinese foods that have in fact been a part of our food landscape for more than 70 years. I wish people could feel less guilt and more entitlement to eat whatever they want. I would argue that nearly all of the ostensible Chinese dishes in Taiwan have become localized. The chuancai I grew up with was made with doubanjiang not from Sichuan Pixian, but from Kaohsiung Gangshan. It was also never very high on the mala profile because we didn't have fresh huajiao, Sichuan peppercorn. Compared to the present-day chuancai in Sichuan, the chuancai I grew up with, made by native Sichuan people, was less oily, less spicy, and the portions were generally smaller. The Shanghai Cai, made in Taiwan similarly, was and still is of a gentler variant than what you see in present-day Shanghai. The red cooked dishes are never very dark, simply because we don't have lao chou jiangyou, dark soy sauce. I didn't even know of the existence of dark soy sauce until I came to the US in 1998. We just have our, like Clarissa talked about, our Taiwanese variant of soy sauce. And when you want the color to be richer, darker, you start out by making a caramel sauce and then add soy sauce into it. So then it will be glazy, red, and rich. But it's still never as dark as what you will get if you use a dark lao chou soy sauce. Our shizitou lion's head meatball is almost always lined with a pot full of napa cabbage, stewed soft. And when I try to do that in Shanghai, people say, no, you don't do that. That is not the right way to do it. First of all, the color is they thought the color was too light. And then it's supposed to be a dark, meaty affair. If you want any vegetable at the very end, maybe you can put 1 or 2 sprigs of bok choy next to it. It's never lined with napa cabbage. So there are every dish, there are many ways to do it. Every family has their own way. Every restaurant has their own way. Somehow, certain ways came to Taiwan and they got standardized and flourished. Other ways stayed in China and we really just developed in different directions. In retrospect, I would say that even Fu Pei Mei, this TV chef, the Julia Child of Taiwan, I would say that even Fu Pei Mei's regional Chinese cooking has a special Taiwan flavor to it. Ever the frugal housewife, she was very adept at using locally available ingredients to recreate the regional Chinese classics that she demoed on TV. If you cannot find a yellow croaker for the famous squirrel fish, songshu huangyu, she said, use a local carp. The dishes that she originally learned from the restaurant chefs were one interpretation from a specific time and place. By writing them into cookbooks, she codified them and made them the standards for future generations. When I first came to the US as a graduate student in 1998, I could always tell if a Chinese restaurant was run by immigrants from Taiwan because the dishes would have a distinctive Fu Pei Mei feel to them, which set them apart from the food in restaurants run by more recent Chinese immigrants. And then think about Din Tai Fung. Everybody knows Din Tai Fung, right? Globally, it is by far the best-known restaurant brand from Taiwan. And look at the dishes they serve: xiaolongbao, steamed dumplings, wontons, red cooked wheat gluten. And the rice dumpling they serve is elongated in shape instead of the typical triangle style in Taiwan. These are all foods of mainlander origin, specifically from the east coast of China. But even in China, where Din Tai Fung has many branch locations, it is seen as representing the Taiwan style. How so? I think it shows up as a whole package. The menu item may have an origin in China, but the lighter hand at seasoning and extreme attention to detail, like 18 pleats to each xiaolongbao, with exactly 16 grams of filling and 5 grams of wrapper, this kind of attention, make them very different from the Chinese variants. The decor and the service also have a distinctive Taiwanese flavor to it. These days, most Taiwanese restaurants overseas clearly and proudly spell out their Taiwan connection. But even when they don't and claim to serve Chinese food, here I'm thinking specifically of Bai Mu Yuan A&J Cafe, which has one location in Rockville, one in Annandale, serving the greater DC area, which advertises themselves as serving authentic Northern Chinese dim sum. Still, well-informed American foodies tend to know that a Taiwanese family runs the restaurant and that the food they serve is understood as Taiwanese. So I don't have an answer as to where and how we should draw the line. It's complicated. You see similar situations elsewhere in the world. Where does Russian food end and Ukrainian food begin? How do we differentiate Israeli food from Palestinian? And it gets even fuzzier when we come to the diaspora context. I think a good rule of thumb is to always err on the side of being more descriptive than prescriptive, more inclusive than exclusive. And that way we'll have a better chance at getting at the full picture. Thank you.
I didn't know if were you going to play a clip or just for time?
I prepared that clip just in case. I don't know. We can, but because Eileen mentioned it, so maybe we can look at
maybe
it.
Yeah, I just I had mentioned remember conversation. This is a 4-part documentary that that Tzu-i hosted and narrated and researched, and I took a little part in it. And she was looking at Chinese food of various regions cooked in diaspora. But this conversation, I mentioned earlier.
This is that one quote.
Yeah.
Be a full screen. Yeah.
我就常常觉得饮食口味跟语言是文化里面最表征的东西。就你人在那个情境里面的时候，就像空气像水，你感觉不到，本来就是这样讲话，本来就吃这个味道。但一离开以后，最明显的感觉就是，哎，听的人家的口音不一样，讲的话不一样，还有吃的口味不一样。
Yeah, so thank you. And it's all four episodes are on YouTube, highly recommended. And not just because I have a cameo, but because we did such a wonderful job. Also really generously showcasing so many innovators in the US, and it would be great to get to know them better.
Including one that we're going to be tasting later.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, Professor Chen Liana catered based on something in the documentary, so that's what you'll be tasting later. So both Clarissa and Tzu-i had such wonderful, rich comments, and I want to thank both of them for, and one thing that we've all discovered is, so all three of us did not know Lao Chou, a soy sauce, because I also grew up in Taiwan without, and it's true. I only started looking for Lao Chou when I moved to China. And so I loved Clarissa's whole investigation into Jinglan soy sauce and also the whole history of soy sauce and shoyu. And there's so many things that we can talk about now, but instead of maybe the obvious one of thinking about Taiwan cuisine, since both of you have touched upon, I actually was really struck by, so Tzu-i knows this, but two things I want to mention. First is that some of you are watching Culinary Class Wars, I hope, on Netflix. I know Tzu-i and I are watching, but it's the Korean reality show competition. But it does bring in, and the show is a lot of fun, and I highly recommend it. It's totally addictive. One thing it does really interesting, I think, from the perspective of this conversation, is that it doesn't really, of course you'll say, oh, this person is a famous Korean style chef. This person is a famous, Italian trained in Napoli, pasta chef. But it doesn't actually fully problematize the differences of the various cuisines, right? So what Japanese would call yoshoku, right? Like Western cuisine as a kind of new category in the 19th century, and therefore also transplanted in Taiwan, is not quite differentiated in this show. It's just 100 Korean dudes, including people of non-Korean heritage. So an Italian chef who works in Korea, for example, or an American chef, or Chinese, a Korean American and a Taiwanese American. So what's interesting is that the focus is really on the styles of cuisine that they choose to embrace. I do feel that in Taiwan, and something that we mentioned, is that the kind of ethnic, and because of Taiwan's, deeply colonial history, the identity of the chef is so embedded in the cooking, right? That it's hard to imagine. So the Taiwan social media has been awash with, why can't we do our own culinary class war? Right? It's like there have been at least 20 op-eds on this topic, and but every time it's always because everybody would point at somebody else saying you're inauthentic, and I think that is a little bit of what you were discussing, that Taiwan has been troubled with this idea that because it's, and Clarissa's introduction talks about this in her book very well, that because it's been so threatened and troubled by being put in a kind of weird, demeaned regional cuisine mode, that the stance is defensive, right? So you're always there. So that's one. And also the other thing that's really fun in this Netflix show is about class. And both of you touch on that. So I guess my first question would be really thinking about a little bit about class, right? Not just say KMT elites versus, sort of the Rechao kind of populism, but rather now in this contemporary moment in Taiwan cuisine, how do we think about class differentials? And this actually relates to my second question about gender, because one of the things that's really interesting, and you both touched on, is that the fifth migrant group, or, that people talk a lot about, is Southeast Asian new migrants, and they've brought a lot of rich cuisine, Burmese, Vietnamese, Thai. And Clarissa, I will confirm that my mother always looks for shrimp fried shrimp xiaoping in U.S. Thai restaurants and is deeply disappointed. And every time I have to explain to her, no, that only exists in Taiwan. So, and she even asked for this in Thailand once when we were there together. So, so there's great Southeast Asian cuisine. But statistically, I was talking to a friend who's a migrant labor activist. She said the largest working migrant group in Taiwan of new migrants is actually from mainland China. It's from the PRC, but a lot of them, of course, have become sort of, they're undocumented or they're, quasi-documented or they're marriage migrants. But since they also recognize the strangeness of their identity, this new migrant group has not brought in new cuisine, right? And so that is a question of class, but also maybe identity. But the second question for both of you is gender, is that all these people we're talking about in the earlier wave of KMT chefs, a lot of them were men, a lot of them were soldiers, bringing in cuisines from their regions. But a lot of the new migrants from China, mostly from not just Fujian, but actually from the kind of Henan area or Anhui areas, are women. The Southeast Asian migrants are women. And so what is that shift in cuisine? Like what, in terms of introducing new dishes and new styles?
Clarissa, you want to answer?
Oh, sorry, you can go first.
Well, I was thinking about the last bit about the gender dimension to it. And in fact, I would think that I feel like in Taiwan, women's place in defining what Taiwanese food was in the past, but Taiwanese style Chinese food was more significant than what you would see in China. Like if I go back to say the trend cai that I grew up with in Taiwan, because the trend cai was not really done in other than a few fancy restaurants. Most of the Sichuan style cooking most people had, was at home. It's done by their mothers or dads, but it's home style. And even the restaurants, even the chefs that came, like I need to organize my thoughts a little bit. I often feel like because with the nationalist government's retreat from China to Taiwan, they brought with them it's a lot of bureaucrats and middle class, and it's not the rich people and the bureaucrats and middle class came, and in China it's the working class, a lot of the working class cooks stay there, and that's why the cooking style really bifurcated there, and that's why you really see the Sichuan style cooking down in Sichuan now. Like very heavily seasoned, very big portion, oily, red, huge. And in Taiwan, it was never like that. It's not really because we didn't have, not just because we didn't have access to the right ingredients. It was because it was always done for your family. And even our restaurants are also more like middle class style, entrepreneur style, small restaurants, as opposed to these days in China, in big cities, or in Hong Kong, and many parts of the world, you have a lot of restaurants run by big restaurant groups. It's really a few groups that's dominating the entire restaurant scenes. Like you go to so many different restaurants, and in the end, it turns out that they're all owned by the same company, and they're very professional. It can be beautiful, and they hire chefs, and the decor is wonderful. And every 5-6 years, they change the concept and all that. That never has been the case in Taiwan. Even the high-end restaurants tend to be independent projects. It's a lot of mom and pop. In the old day, mom and pop. These days, young people like pouring their heart and soul into it. But it's like a small place, a coffee shop, where they're doing the more feminine style of cooking. That is trying to nourish their family and not be huge and loud and impressive like that. And in that kind of a restaurant landscape, I feel like there's a lot of room for the women, the mothers, and all these new immigrants, because that's just what we're used to, and people are so health conscious, right? You never want anything that's just impressive. You want something that tastes good and feels good for you. Right?
Yeah, Clarissa.
Yeah, so I can only speak to what I see in Taiwan today on a day-to-day basis. I don't know that much about the demographics or the immigrants or what restaurants they're opening. I don't have that data. But I will say most young people in Taiwan don't know how to cook because they don't need to cook. Food is extremely cheap here. And so you don't really see that much of a class divide in that respect, like someone who works at a fancy office building in Qingyin district will go to a street stall vendor and get that $2 bento, same as someone who is a migrant worker to grab that bento. But you do see a class division in sort of the fine dining restaurants, or what people pursue eating for leisure. And I would say, a lot of these high-end restaurants, they have that Western flair to it, because that's kind of what I see these trends going to. They have that Western flair, but with a Taiwanese flavor. So there'll be, classically trained French chefs making Taiwanese food, or not necessarily Western, but an international flair. There's this restaurant that's blowing up right now, and I think it's like Peruvian chefs who have come to Taiwan, and they're taking Taiwanese ingredients and putting their own Peruvian spin on that. So that's what I can see on just on a shallow level. And I was actually just talking to Pizza Hut Taiwan the other week. I was at their office doing an interview with them, and they said, Pizza Hut Taiwan, most of our orders are just through Uber. And I get it. Like, Taiwan is the land of convenience. And the longer I live here, the less I go out, because it's so easy to just pull up an app and have things come to you. And I see that especially for lunch and dinner, people do the same. So you don't necessarily see as much of a class divide as you do in the States in Taiwan. And that's very apparent to me. And it's just because for food costs are generally quite low. At the same time, for a lot of the street food vendors, even when I was growing up, going to Tainan, a lot of the street food vendors were owned by family-owned. There were family-owned stalls that had been passed down by multiple generations. But because that's not so much economically viable today, because young people don't want to do that anymore, you see this gentrification when it comes to these stalls. So most night market stalls are actually franchises, or they'll cook everything in a central kitchen and then they'll ship it off to the same company that has multiple stalls in a lot of the night markets. And there are still night markets, like Ningxia Night Market, for example, or still vendors that are second or third generation. But to be a successful restaurateur, you want to scale. So the successful ones I see, they build the brick and mortars, they get air conditioning. Something that really bothers me about people's perception of Taiwanese food is like the best food is something by the street and dirty and outside. But for people who have visited, it is extremely hot here, and it's just getting hotter with global warming. And if you are successful, you want to get in a brick and mortar with air conditioning. And that's where I personally find the best food. And I would say that dynamic has changed and has become apparent just these 10 years. It's very different from when I was coming here as a kid. And with globalization as well, the food of Taipei is also becoming just so much more international. And as Tzu-i mentioned, the coffee shop culture here is insane. I would say Taiwan has actually some of the best coffee shop cultures in the entire world as well. And the food there is also very different. I'm now going on a tangent, so I will bring it back to Eileen.
Great. Thank you so much. And now, of course, I'm dying to read your Pizza Hut interview and as to why they always have the craziest pizza toppings. But
they do it on purpose. Yeah.
Yes, it always goes viral, right? So
yeah.
But I know that we have very little time left, but we'd love to take questions from the audience. If anybody would like to have a question for the panel, for Clarissa, for Tzu-i. Yeah. So, sure. And we have to speak up a little bit. So,
my name is Alan Joe. I'm an undergraduate student in Georgetown. Speaking of Taiwanese cuisine, I'm from South Korea. Taiwanese cuisines are extremely popular in South Korea with a lot of franchise stores like Gongcha or there's a store called Hongwei Jin. They sell a lot of Chinese sandwiches, and like you can spot them in every street of South Korea. The Taiwanese franchise stores could be spotted in South Korea, like very easily. With that being said, I just had a question about international relations and how would that kind of Taiwanese soft power could mingle into like improving like Korea-Taiwan bilateral relations or any kind of like even Taiwan-Japan and like Taiwan and US, and how would that work based on how Taiwanese franchise stores could be working? Thank you.
I mean, this is such a great question, just because in case people hadn't heard, was just really about Chinese cuisine, also in South Korea, its popularity, also in Japan, but also the way it might be a kind of soft power, right? I mean, actually, that was something that really struck me on Culinary Class Wars, is how much Chinese food is fetishized in that show, right? They're treated, right. The Dong Po Ro. I mean, God, Dong Po Ro made like 5 appearances in that show. And so, but then a kind of undifferentiated Chineseness, rather than say this is a very specific cuisine, right? Which I thought was really interesting. Would love to hear from what you both think. I mean, I have thoughts because I teach on Chinatowns, but yeah, so go ahead.
Well, I can't say about South Korea or in Japan, but in the US, you definitely see Taiwanese food gaining visibility, popularity, and the fact that restaurants now name themselves Taiwanese instead of undifferentiated Chinese really makes an impact. And yeah,
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a Chinese restaurants have been in this country for 200 years, and so it's great. It's so integrated, but then it's also a burden because it came with a distinct reputation, I guess, style. And so, and you compare Chinese restaurant in the U.S. with say Thai or Vietnamese restaurant in the U.S. Chinese restaurants just tend to, until recently, had this image of being lower end and older, hole in the wall type of place, whereas new Southeast Asian restaurant or say Japanese restaurant, they came later, and then right away they can be high end or trendy, whereas Chinese restaurants just had that entrenched feel to it, right? Now it's starting to change all around. But Taiwanese restaurant was when they're branding themselves differently as Taiwanese, it's like a fresh start. And like that brew pub I went to, it's a completely modern concept. This is the kind of thing that can like without saying much, like affect people's understanding of what this alienation means. And going back a little bit to Culinary Class War, I just yesterday I watched this interview of Edward Lee, who's a Korean American chef who's a star in this show, and in that interview he talked about how he has always cared a lot about immigrant food in the U.S. And he says he sees 3 different waves of immigrant food representation. And the first wave is mom and pop shop. They're doing what they can, their flavor from home, using ingredients that they could find. And it's never very high end. It's just what they could do to make a living. And then the second wave you see was in the context of Korean food in America, like bulgogi, burrito, or kimchi on hot dog. This kind of kitschy fusion snack food. But he sees the beginning of a third wave where people are thinking more thoughtfully about Korean flavor or other immigrant cuisines, like the essentials, and paring it down to a pure reflection of what the cuisine tastes like and meant to them. And I'm starting to see that about Taiwanese food in the U.S. as well. So this, for example, like this restaurant, Good to Eat Dumplings in Oakland, that I believe Clarissa recently did an event there. They on a normal day-to-day basis, they do Taiwan xiaochi, but using locally sourced organic ingredients, everything beautiful but very casual. But twice a month on the weekends, Chef Tony does Taiwanese style bando, so the festive food, which is a very special kind of a banquet that you see in the countryside in Taiwan on the streets, but it's not low end. It's like very, very meticulous, fine cooking. It's a lot of tables there, but like very traditional, like good Taiwanese food. And so she does that, and there's no catering to the American palate or preconceived notion of what Taiwanese food should be. She just did what she believed was the best style Taiwanese bundle food. And every time it sold out. And I went to one, and it was not Taiwanese people. It's not the Taiwanese diaspora in the Bay Area that attended. It's people of all kinds, and it's being appreciated. And I think that is when you see that kind of thing, you really see Taiwanese soft power gaining ground here.
Great. Clarissa.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think when you're talking about these corporate chains or restaurants, just by adding Taiwan to their name is already a soft power move. I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley where my high school was 70% ethnically Taiwanese. It was insane. And growing up, there were a lot of Chinese restaurants, right? But the owners were either from Hong Kong or Taiwan. And no one really labeled themselves, oh, this is Hong Kong food or Taiwan food, not because they were ashamed of their origins, but because it wouldn't make sense to the mainstream, because the world at large had no idea what Taiwan is. We have come to a point where people now know that Taiwan is different from China, that Taiwan is unique. And so you can put that label, Taiwanese cuisine. I got to interview the second generation founders of Ding Tai Fung. And, it seemed like they're, very much leaning into their Taiwanese roots, where in the beginning, they sort of, shied away from that a little bit more. It was like, oh yeah, our family came from China. They were leaning into their Chinese side as well. But now they're celebrating their heritage as both Taiwanese and Chinese and embracing that diversity. So I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think just the fact I've been a food writer for over a decade now. And I remember in the beginning, if I wrote about Taiwanese food or this is a Taiwanese place, it almost felt like saying a dirty word. And even when I put in my book recipes and stories from the island nation, it felt like I was going to offend someone, and it's just kind of this knee-jerk reaction from back in the day where you're not allowed to say Taiwanese food has its own distinct thing. So I think just even labeling something Taiwanese is a move in itself.
A great Saka. I'm sorry, there was another hand. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, so I'm a geography student here, and also recently interned in Global Taiwan Institute. And my question is, just besides the Chinese food that you mentioned that is deeply blended into Taiwanese culture, probably it's a very new trend happening in Taiwan. Probably 1 year, 2 years ago, there's a bunch of Chinese cuisine that is newly introduced in Taiwan. Probably because of the prevalence of Douyin, Xiaohongshu, this kind of social media, and they are coming in Taiwan not only a little bit changed our landscape of food, and also the terms, the words we use, like they use the different ways to call the same food or ingredient, but people can easily recognize these words, but maybe for younger generation, they started to confuse by these different way of calling the food. So what do you think about this kind of changing? Is that maybe a threat or something? Yeah.
So I'll just say, and thank you that because there is food awaiting, so we'll have to conclude there. And this actually question mirrors very well a question from Ling Shanjiang on chat, also about authenticity and fusion. So maybe we'll just conclude with your thoughts. Yeah.
Clarissa, you want to say something?
Sure. I'll say something. I don't think it's a threat at all. I think, again, Taiwan is cool because we're all about introducing new influences. And because the concept of what Taiwanese identity is this big question mark, all of these influences and waves, social media trends from new immigrants, it's very welcomed here. And in a way, being in Taiwan does remind me of being in the States as well. It really is a melting pot, even though on a surface level, it doesn't look like that. And Taiwan, of all places, is open to these flavor profiles. And as Tzu-i said, it's a culinarily cosmopolitan place. So diversity, again, as I mentioned in my presentation, is really what the core of what it means. what is how I define Taiwanese food. You know, so much of Taiwanese food is made up of our diverse influences and histories from different people from all over, and that will continue to shape as time goes on. So I'm excited to see how food will morph. And on that authenticity note, I really hate that word authenticity, because what you're talking about is that you are trying to impose a certain time or place, an arbitrary time and place on another people. There is no such thing as authenticity. It's more what you choose to represent at a given period of time.
Thank you, Clarissa.
I'll add a few things. So I haven't been to one of those restaurants that you mentioned, the new Chinese-style Chinese restaurants in Taiwan. I imagine people probably welcome it because it's an island where people are obsessed with food, and any kind of new flavor is like a fresh trend, and people want to check it out. And there are a lot of things that are delicious in China that really, until recently in Taiwan, you couldn't get. But I would imagine that those are probably precisely the kind of restaurants that I saw passing by on buses that had the signboard saying they are Sichuan Liaoli. I think it's a way to really mark that this is not the Sichuan Cai we've always been eating in Taiwan. This is a foreign kind of Sichuan Cai. So they had to use the Japanese word to mark that exceptional part of it. And I've heard, like, so one of the food writers who helped curated the presidential inauguration banquet menu, Liz Gao, I recently saw her posting online this thoughts about how, like, it's just so hard to grapple with what Chinese food means in the Taiwan context. Like, when you write, you just have to find so many creative ways to avoid the word Chinese. And it's very hard for me. Like, when you say that Zhonghua, I have to say I have a Zhonghua way, not a Zhongguo way. There are all kinds of things. But she said, just a thought. Why don't we start talking about, there are Korean style Chinese food, Japanese style Chinese food, Indian style Chinese food. There's American Chinese food. Can we say there's Taiwanese style Chinese food? I don't know. So it seems like there's a push for that. There's Taiwanese style Chinese food, and then there's Zhongguo Liaoli. That's new and not part of us. It's something interesting to try, but it's not really part of our complex history.
Wow, so thank you. That's a wonderful place for us to conclude, and we can continue our conversation next door in 50.
Yes, that's right. So, excuse me. So now we'll move to the food tasting portion. It's mostly snacks, not a full meal, I'm sorry. But yes, please follow our staff at the 503 conference room just down the hall. And thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, guys. Enjoy.